Hi everyone, and I hope you're doing well. This weekend we come to that part in Luke's Gospel, in part of Luke chapter 6, which is known as the Sermon on the Plain. So named because in verse 17 you get Jesus standing on a level place. It's the parallel to what we might know of in Matthew 5, 6 and 7, called the Sermon on the Mount, where you have Jesus teaching his people. And they're the sort of words that I think maybe should come with a warning. Because if we take them seriously, as we must if we are authentic followers of Jesus, then they could really change and transform our lives. There's a lot in here, and it talks about how we are called to be different from our society that influences and moulds us so much, even without us knowing about it. I'm just going to pick out a few points. That's all I've got time to do here. But I'd encourage you to take time to read and reflect on it and come back to it over a few days. I started reading and thinking about this on Thursday. I'm recording this on Sunday. And over the last few days, God has answered some of the questions I had about the text and has revealed new things to me in it. So please take time to just read and reflect and to think. So I'm going to pick out a few points. In verses 17 to 26, Jesus is speaking to two groups of people. He refers to them as the poor, maybe those who are hungry, those who are weeping. And he refers to the rich, the well-fed. And it's as though there's two groups of people. And he seems to be saying that it's the poor, the hungry, the struggling who are really blessed. And it's the rich who are in a bad place. The opposite to how his society is being taught to think and how our society would speak today. But is it all about being poor is good and being rich is bad? I don't think it is. I think it's to do with the attitude that is behind that. And we see this throughout Luke's writings. In chapter 4, verse 18, Jesus in the synagogue speaks about proclaiming good news to the poor. Whereas in 18:24, he speaks about how hard it is for the rich to enter the kingdom of God. Not that it's impossible, but it's hard. We see Zacchaeus in chapter 19 coming to meet with Jesus, but it does involve a change in attitude and priority. So I think the question it's asking is not whether we're rich or poor, but whether we are allowing ourselves to depend on God, to trust in God for everything that we need, or whether we are relying on our own strength, our own resources, our own abilities. And it's only with that humbleness of attitude, when we acknowledge our complete dependence on him, that we can really and truly follow Jesus. And that applies whether we are poor, as society would see it, or whether we are rich. What is our attitude towards God? Then in 27 to 36, he speaks about loving our enemies. And the things he asks for here seem to be really, really difficult. Loving our enemies, doing good to those who hate us, blessing those who curse us, praying for those who mistreat us. Someone slaps us on the cheek, turning the other cheek as well. I think it's important to think about what these verses are not saying before we think about what they are. The work that Lisa with colleagues has done has identified the reality of spiritual abuse in faith communities and the sadness that comes with that. We've seen news headlines that says that domestic abuse has increased significantly during these lockdown periods. And are we saying that those who experience that type of abuse should just put up with it? That's not right. That's not what these verses are saying. These things do need to be recognised. They do need to be brought into the light. They do need to be dealt with. And those who are being abused offered the support and help that they need, and that we build healthy church communities and safe family environments. But I think what Jesus is doing here, if he's not talking about that, I think is building on what he said earlier, particularly in verse 22 and 23, where he talks about being hated and insulted and rejected because of him. It follows on from recognition that if we are living as authentic followers of Jesus, then this really is something we should expect. And when that happens, when we're accused and when things are said against us, because we are following Jesus, because we are living for Jesus, because we are standing up for what he says is right, when we're accused for those things, we should not seek to get our own back. We should pray for those people because we love them and because we want them to come to know Jesus as well. We see the example of Jesus himself in chapter 23 as he's just being nailed to the cross. He says, Father, forgive to those who are nailing him to that cross. We see this in Stephen, that first martyr, in Luke chapter 7, verse 60, as he's being stoned by those he's managed to really wind up. He says, Lord, do not hold this sin against them. There is that call to forgive and pray for those who oppose us because we stand for Jesus. Are we prepared to live this way? And if we are, it makes us so much bolder in our witness, in our stand for God, as we're less concerned about how people will respond as we live for Jesus. Our priority is him, his kingdom, and seeking to introduce others to him. And then he goes on to talk about giving to those who ask of us. I don't think it is saying that we should all give away everything we have. Jesus is not calling for a society where none of his followers have anything. But I think it's about how we think of people. One of my early memories of school when I was very young was when my mother bought for me a geometry kit. I was very proud of my geometry kit. It had a small pencil and a protractor and a compass and a small ruler, and it was useful in some of the school lessons. And I remember her saying to me, don't lend anything in this to anybody else. And I understand why she said that. It would cost money, and if she thought if I lent it to anybody else, I wouldn't get it back, or it could get broken and she'd have to replace it, and it would be an expense and a faff. And I totally get that. But that's not the attitude that Jesus is calling for here. Think about somebody coming to you and saying, do you have £10 I could have? I suggest your answer would depend on the relationship you have with that person. If it's a spouse, if it's a son or a daughter, you'd be probably much more inclined to say yes than if it was somebody who just walked up to you on the street and you'd never met before. And depending on our relationships, where people fit on that spectrum, then that would influence our response. But I think what Jesus is saying here is actually we should consider everybody in that way. In that way we can act generously towards them. Our idea of family should be extended, yes, to our church family, but also wider afield, and to be generous, recognizing that our God is a God of plenty, a God who provides, who calls us to be generous, to be like him. Jesus develops this story in chapter 10 as he talks about the Good Samaritan. And he asks the question, to whom are we prepared to act as neighbour? And as Jesus talks about giving to our enemies, loving our enemies, he's talking, I think, about encouraging us to see each person with love and care and compassion, however they are treating us, whatever relationship we have with them. And then he says, we will be children of the Most High, because he is kind to the ungrateful and wicked. We are called to be merciful, just as our Father is merciful. And then from verse 37 to 42, he talks about not judging others. And this is so different to our society today, our society that's becoming much more judgmental, much more critical of others. So much of social media is full of people saying nasty things about other people because they disagree with their politics, because they disagree with their attitudes, because they don't like their hairstyle or choice of clothes. We seem to have taken the idea of freedom of speech to mean that we can say anything we want, often prefacing it with, well, this is just my opinion, with little thought of how it will impact the people that we're speaking about. Here Jesus calls us not to judge, not to condemn, to forgive, to be generous in giving. And he warns about this strange idea about specks of sawdust in our in our brother's eye and a plank in our own. And I think there's a call here to be really reflecting on our attitudes and behaviours and to seek to ensure that they are right, as opposed to trying to correct everyone else. And yes, there are times when it's right to speak out in face of injustice and evil, but so much of what is said these days is purely personal opinion. Back in early July last year, a group of ministers, including a good friend of mine, were organising a demonstration in central London to speak into the issue of racial injustice and to call on the government to implement all the recommendations that come out from various inquiries and committees over the last 10 years to try and address the issue of the way people of different ethnic backgrounds and races are treated unjustly in this country. It was something that a lot of us were talking about at the time, something I felt very strongly was right, what they were planning to do. And for a time, I was planning to go down to London and join with them. But a couple of weeks before this event was due to take place, the government said that it is no longer lawful for groups of more than 6 people to meet outside. And that caused a problem. And the event went ahead. And whether it was right to go ahead or not is the sort of question we'll be reflecting on in our next apologetic session in February. How much as the people of God are we under the authority of the government in the country in which we live in? So that's that discussion. I chose not to go. I weighed the various things up and thought, for me, it was not right. But what these verses have spoken to me about this week is that before I criticise them, if I choose to do so, I have a responsibility to think about how I am engaging with the issue of racial justice and to ensure that that engagement is right. That I have the right desire and the heart to ensure that everybody is welcomed and part of the community, and that where I see issues of injustice, I stand up against that and I speak against that. I need to make sure that that is right, and even to ask their insights for where I've got that wrong. And from that position of self-examination and try to make sure that as much as I can, I've got that bit right, then it's appropriate maybe to ask questions of them about the choices that they are making. Let's make sure that we got the big things in our lives right before we try and point out the small things that are wrong in others. Because it's so easy to be critical of others. It can be so damaging. But how much do we take time to reflect on our own thoughts, our own attitudes, our own behaviours? And how much do we welcome it when those in relationship with us challenge us gently and appropriately about what we are doing? Then in verses 43 and 45, Jesus speaks about a tree and its fruit. I don't really have time to talk about this, but it's really a challenge about hypocrisy. Do our attitudes and thoughts live up to our actions and words? Why don't you take some time to reflect on that? And then Jesus finishes in verse 46 to 49 with a closing challenge. If you claim to be following me, he says, why don't you do what I say? He makes it clear that we have a choice. He talks about 2 ways of living. He does not force us to act in a particular way. But one way, he says, that of hearing and obeying results in a stable and secure life, even through difficulty and trouble. And the other option eventually leads to destruction. Jesus is saying you have a choice, but there is a clear statement as to which is best, which I want you to do in my kingdom. Jesus is clear and uncompromising. And so many of his followers down through the centuries have chosen to ignore his words and conform to the society around us. It is easier. It helps us to fit in. It makes us less useful in the kingdom of God. It means we're not being obedient to Jesus. How are we going to respond? Why not take time with God to ask him to show you one thing he wants to change in your life, and for the grace and strength to do so? Here are some questions to think about. How seriously do we take these words of Jesus today? Which of these sayings of Jesus do you find most challenging, and why? If you were to fully adopt one of these ways of living, which would make the biggest impact for God's kingdom? God bless us all.